Back with us now for the interview is Sally Yates. She's the former acting Attorney General of the United States. Thank you again for being here. Last month, we got to see a letter that was sent to the special counsel's office from the president's lawyers. It ended up getting published in the New York Times. And that letter included references to you, references to memos that the White House counsel, Don McGahn, had written about his interactions with you about Mike Flynn. And in those memos, at least according to the president's lawyers, he says that when you came to the White House to warn about the possible compromise of Flynn as national security advisor, you never indicated to him that Flynn was actually under investigation. The lawyer letter cites the quote, White House understanding that there was no FBI investigation of Flynn. And that seems like maybe a fine point. The reason it ends up being important and the reason the president's lawyers are writing about it to the special counsel's office is because I think there's an idea that it may look more like obstruction of justice on the part of the president if when he went to the FBI director and said lay off Flynn, he knew there was an open FBI investigation into Michael Flynn. So the White House counsel saying you never indicated that Flynn was the subject of an investigation. Can you shed any light on that?
Well, yeah. When I testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee, I talked about the two different meetings that I had with Mr. McGahn. And in the first meeting, Mr. McGahn asked me whether or not the investigation was criminal or whether or not it was a counterintelligence investigation.
So he referenced
and I declined to answer that.
Okay.
And then I also testified that in the follow-up meeting the next day, he wanted to know whether if they took any action, whether that would negatively impact the investigation, because they didn't want to negatively impact anything that was going on in the investigation. So he and I talked back and forth in both meetings about impact on an investigation.
And if the president, in that context, having been advised, presumably by his White House counsel, that there was an investigation concerning the national security advisor, if the president then went to the director of the FBI and said, ease up on Mike Flynn, who he knows is the subject of an investigation, how much ambiguity is there? How much legal wiggle room is there as to whether or not that was an effort to obstruct that investigation?
You know, I'm not going to get into sort of a legal definition of obstruction there, because I think that's really up to Bob Mueller and his folks to make that determination. But certainly, from what we know about that, it sounds like that there was an effort to influence the investigation.
I mentioned at the top of the show that there's been some new reporting related to a new indictment that's been handed down, actually not by the special counsel's office, but within the National Security Division of the Justice Department, about this alleged secret Russian agent, Maria Butina, and her involvement with a U.S. person who's been identified sort of circumstantially in press reports. What's been reported by the Washington Post is that that person who was involved with this alleged Russian agent recommended the Deputy National Security Advisor for her post, KT McFarland. Since the Flynn investigation, since the Flynn affair and your role in it, we have learned that Mr. Flynn doesn't appear to have been acting alone when he contacted the Russian government. And in fact, when he made those contacts that he later pled guilty to lying to the FBI about, Ms. McFarland appears to have been involved not only in knowing about them, but in setting those up. She also appears to have not been truthful with the Senate when she was asked about those. If Flynn wasn't acting alone, does that change anything materially? Does that make the case about Flynn resonate in any more or less worrying way if there was somebody else who was involved with him and he wasn't on his own?
Well, I don't know if it's more or less worrying. I mean, certainly if there are other people who are involved in this, then our Justice Department ought to want to find that out, to get to the bottom of that. And it sounds like that's exactly what's going on right now with Special Mueller's investigation on this, and with General Flynn's cooperation on this as well.
He's awaiting sentencing. His sentencing's been pushed back a few times. What is, as observers, what should we read into that?
That is common when someone is still continuing to provide information or to cooperate in other ways in investigation, that you put off their sentencing until all of the cooperation is complete, so that the judge, when he or she is sentencing the defendant, has the benefit of knowing everything that they did in an effort to try to assist the government in cooperation.
So the longer it goes on, the more cooperation we can infer?
Yes. Yeah.
Roughly speaking. We'll be right back with Sally Yates, former acting Attorney General of the United States. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.